You're listening to The Streaming Wars, the podcast that discusses all of the latest happenings regarding your favorite streaming services. Find out which service is winning the war this time around.
Hello everyone and welcome to the latest episode of The Streaming Wars. I'm Dustin and Tony is with me and we are here to discuss everything from July 22nd through the 28th. We have a bunch of news. We're going to get back to those Netflix Q2 results that we kind of skimmed past or skimmed over very quickly last episode. We're going to talk a little bit more in detail about that. We've got some other articles that are really interesting and some things outside of the main players that we have to talk about. So we're going to breeze through some of this stuff because there's a lot of individual news stories, but not a whole lot to actually discuss when it comes to it. So let's jump into Netflix. First up, Netflix has landed the French survival thriller O2. There is a Ryan Reynolds time travel film project that was previously at Paramount that is going to be moving over to Netflix. There are 2 documentaries focusing on the deaf community that has been ordered by Netflix. Netflix has paid 7 figures for a horror short story originally published on Reddit. Netflix has ordered a prequel series, a live-action prequel series that is, from The Witcher, telling the origin of the original Witcher. Carolina Rivera has signed an overall deal, and that is Netflix. Prime Video, there is a graphic novel called Paper Girls that there's an adaptation that has been ordered at Amazon, and BBC's The Pursuit of Love has also landed at Amazon. Jumping over to Hulu, actress Joey King has signed a first look deal with Hulu, and you might be thinking, who's she? Not because she's not super popular, but because specifically she's not a huge name and she's not somebody you would expect to land a first look overall deal, but she has recently done a project over at Netflix called The Kissing Booth that has garnered a lot of attention. There's a sequel that just released. There's the original one came out, I believe, 2 years ago, and there's already a third one that has already actually been filmed that's planned to release next year. So needless to say, that project has been successful for Netflix. Hulu has recognized this, and they're trying to get more of the young adult type projects that are geared towards teenagers and, people in their 20s that really attract that younger audience that Hulu is really aiming to try to get. Elizabeth Moss, the actress who's best known for probably Mad Men and also The Handmaid's Tale, she has launched a production company which has then signed a first look deal with Hulu and Fox 21. Hulu is developing an alternate history drama called Rodham, based off of if Hillary Clinton actually won the election in 2016. And then there is a new animated comedy series in development from John and Dave Sharin for Hulu as well. There is nothing for CBS All Access. Apple TV Plus. Apple has ordered the metaphysical thriller series called Shining Girls. Werner Herzog's Meteorite documentary, Fireball, is heading to Apple TV+. Oprah will actually host a new talk show on Apple TV+, and this is actually coming very, very soon. It's called The Conversation, and it's coming, I believe, next week. And then finally, Apple looks to shift their content strategy after the success of Greyhound. Now, we've talked about this at length over multiple episodes about films and Apple paying way too much. And this article kind of dives into the fact that because they've had some decent success with some of these film projects, and they have more film projects lined up, they're looking at it from a perspective of maybe they can just buy film projects rather than developing full TV series as much as they originally planned. While I'm not going to sit here and say it's not a okay approach, it probably is actually less costly than developing full TV series by themselves over time, but I think long term, the TV series have much more promise for the longevity of the series. You have a film that releases, and while one film may get a sequel, or you might have a franchise within the films, TV series are the ones that really have the longevity because people can watch them over and over. The engagement level is much higher. So personally, I don't think that it's a bad thing for the immediate future, but I think long term, it's not going to help Apple TV Plus grow to the lengths that they want to.
It's interesting to see other people kind of pick up the same threads that we were talking about a while back, and even though it's it's now publicly being talked about how they are changing their strategy. You could clearly see, especially if I'm just imagining, thinking back through the show notes that we had multiple times of Apple taking on new projects, new feature films, and it's like, okay, all right, I kind of see where you're going. I see the trend. Seeing them shell out large amounts of cash for these projects, it's like, okay, we know that they're spinning their way out of their predicament right now, and that makes a lot of sense. I thought the most important quote in this whole entire article is, quote, what Apple offers legacy studios sitting on films that they can't release in theaters, namely those without streaming services, is a guaranteed payday. And I read that, I was just skimming through it, just trying to get the most important parts, then it just stuck with me. I was like, wait, no, that is the most important part of this article. Is not necessarily that Apple is shifting their content strategy. I mean, I think that it is, but what makes Apple an appealing target for as a distribution channel for some of these entertainment companies, these streaming companies, is the amount of cash that they're willing to spend, and they can at least break even or make a little bit of a profit during this COVID-19 time where production houses are struggling with stay-at-home orders and trying to get content out. But really, it's people, just the mass general public, especially in the United States, just isn't in the mood, so to speak, to go to any type of theater chain. Even if they are open, there's going to be capacity reasons why they won't be able to get a full seating, but then also just culturally and psychologically, just people aren't trusting up public areas quite yet. So it makes sense why these production houses who are sitting on content need to find a decent distribution partner to share it. And you would think that maybe, okay, sharing it with like Netflix, selling it for Netflix or Amazon Prime would be a good option. And it's like, well, maybe they do have more numbers than Apple TV Plus. They do have a bigger reach, bigger cachet. I mean, they could do a lot more for that piece of product. But if Apple's going to consistently, I think personally, overbid on these projects and give just huge sums of money where they can at least break even or get a significant chunk, just a lump sum from that, it makes a lot of sense. And this might be, COVID-19 might actually be a good thing for Apple, because you're going to have these streaming players who want to offload their content, and Apple is paying top dollar right now. There could be a little bit of a mutual benefit there of the Apple's going to overpay for these projects and give these people their money, and then also they're going to get Apple's going to get high profile projects that would have been released in theaters and would have returned some revenue, would have gotten some notoriety, and they're on their service. So there's a little bit of a mutual benefit relationship between the two. And I think that thinking of it that way, it's kind of interesting. So I thought personally that line was the most important given the current, socioeconomical climate that is, COVID-19.
Yeah, and if anything, the most important, I think, is obviously, like you said, it's a payday, but it's also just because right now in this very time frame, a lot of these mid-budget films that maybe would only cost $50 to $150 million, even 150 is a little pushing it, but a lot of these films aren't necessarily going to even have the opportunity, because by the time the theaters are widespreadly opened, it's not going to be a situation where a lot of these mid-budget films are going to be able to get into the theaters and be able to compete with the larger big-budget films that have been purposely held back from the theaters for them to make sure that they can make as much money as they can. I'm talking Tenet, Mulan, Wonder Woman. These are films that are set in the first couple, within the first couple of months of after the theaters reopen. These are films that the executives within the respective media companies have said, we have no interest in releasing these on the streaming services. These are too big of films in order to not put them out in theaters. And I agree, but there are definitely a bunch of films here that can, in fact, be released on streaming services. And Apple is obviously just providing one opportunity for these production companies to walk away with some money, which can't be a bad thing when you're in a pandemic and you're hurting for opportunities to be able to make money in the first place. So there's that. All right, so Disney Plus, there's a Halloween-themed comedy in the works. This is supposedly in the same vein of how there was a film called Noelle that launched with Disney Plus. There was a holiday-themed film that released for the service. Now there's a Halloween one that is meant to be called Spooked. Jumping over to Quibi, Quibi has announced a new animated series called Fudda Mucka with Ryan Reynolds and Samuel L. Jackson attached. They've also ordered a series called Eye Candy, which has Chrissy Teigen attached, at least as a producer as of now. And then finally with Quibi, Quibi is now allowing screenshots, but it is with a catch. You cannot actually screenshot the service itself how you would typically screenshot something on your phone. It in fact has a special button that they had to create, which leads to the question of, okay, so maybe this wasn't Quibi's fault in the first place, and it was actually explained it made a lot of actual sense when it was explained. It turns out that content in general, there's what is DRM, digital rights management, which keeps the protection of the content from being able to be recorded or to be screenshotted. It's the same reason why the same thing will happen with Disney Plus if you try to do the exact same thing. The difference, of course, is that Quibi is a mobile first or mobile specific service. Unlike Disney Plus, which is available on a wide variety of different platforms, Quibi you couldn't even watch on the computer and grab a screenshot that way. But when it comes to mobile, that is what Quibi was trying to push, and it unfortunately was having some issues with getting just free self-promotion by not having the screenshot capability. So it has been explained, but of course it is one of those things where, DRM is real, and Quibi just kind of felt the brunt of that situation.
Yeah, the new workflow isn't that bad. You basically just put your finger on the screen, hold for a little bit, and then you will slide your thumb or finger, whatever you're touching the screen with, over, and you can create a snapshot that way. It's a little bit from the iPhone user perspective. You basically just touch like one or two buttons and you get your screenshot. So it's a little bit more involved than that, but overall it's not the end of the world. People can now screenshot their content. That's great. I think that this was a huge communication failure by the higher ups at Quibi. The Twitter thread does a really good job explaining the pitfalls of DRM, not the pitfalls of DRM in general, but in this specific case of how it is limiting people's ability to take screenshots. So digital rights management. That's a complex series of protocols essentially trying to help publishers ensure that other people don't pirate their content. DRM has been a big thing for a long time. I remember when it got really big with like iTunes and MP3s and MP3 players and dealing with all that. That was a huge thing back then. Short story is that DRM, that's enforced in the operating system of the devices. So that is not a protocol that Quibi can, bolt onto their app. It's actually a part of the underlying phone itself. It's something that it will support. So if the content producer wants DRM protection on any of their stuff, that is handled at a very different level. So that authentication for the DRM content is not within Quibi's domain. And so instead of saying, hey, we cannot through the app allow screenshots because it is a issue that it's like, Apple or Google or whoever has to deal with that. Hey, we can't do that, so we can't do screenshots. I felt that would be an adequate answer. Like, okay, fine, you can't do a screenshot because you literally are not technically able to do screenshots given that your app is on somebody else's operating system. Like, that makes total sense, and I feel like users of the app would have been okay with that explanation. It makes a lot of sense, and it's simple. But instead, we got, Katzenberg saying he just didn't handle the situation well, and so that was extremely frustrating. And yeah, so it was a good Twitter thread if you like computers and stuff. Tom Conrad dives more into it to try to break it down as simple as possible. But basically, DRM is this weird protocol that's out there. Lots of people hate it, lots of people love it, and people love to hate it. So it's got a very interesting history in terms of just any type of content coming online or to consumers. So it's just I wish that they would have handled this earlier and easier and simpler. This could have almost not even been a story at all of just, hey, on day one, we got some complaints that we can't do screenshots. Here's the reason why. It's a technical liability thing that we can't figure out. We can't overcome at the moment. We will try to do something, but work with us. That would have been awesome and succinct and sufficient. But instead, they allowed screenshots to become a huge story and a negative detractor for the service, which just goes to show how much I think Quibi is just struggling with leadership. So I'll get off my soapbox with Quibi, but after just reading the tweet, I was just like, really? This could have been handled many months ago. It would have been very simple.
This could have been easily something that they could have handled at the very, before the service actually launched. They could have just been upfront about it and said, hey, we want this to happen. Obviously, we are mobile first, so we want mobile devices to be able to screenshot it so that you can talk about our content. We want this, but it didn't happen, and they just kind of ignored it. And then when it was brought up at launch by all the tech sites, it was kind of like a question of, well, why? Why would we need that? And it just feels like you said, the leadership wasn't really like forward thinking about the service as a whole. And that is outside of just the screenshots, and we've talked about that.
No, I completely agree with you that they should have thought about this beforehand, but even trying to give them as much benefit of doubt that I could possibly muster their way, it's like, come on. We spent 6 minutes talking about Quibi and screenshots. Like, it's a little ridiculous how this has become a story, and it's Quibi's fault, and it's like, really, Quibi?
Yeah, and I will admit, the thing that really sucks about Quibi is that I don't care at all about using the service, but there was a trailer just released for their Fugitive series, and it looks interesting. I would probably check it out, but I have no desire to sign up for Quibi just for the one show that I see that I would check out. So unfortunate for Quibi. All right, jumping over to HBO Max. HBO Max has added a number of international titles to its lineup. This includes Gomorrah, which is a series that was originally on Netflix that was not a Netflix original, but Netflix had the international streaming rights to. Now is available on HBO Max along with a number of other series. The first 4 Conan O'Brien produced comedy specials have been announced for HBO Max. Those we already knew were coming, but they actually are happening now. The Wild is being adapted by HBO Max as well. And then we have a bunch of stuff related to their quarterly results. This wasn't worth a massive discussion point because there's not a whole lot here, but there is going to be some stuff we want to talk about. So first up, HBO Max has drawn about 4 million signups. Now, to clarify exactly what that means, because I know a lot of people are like, well, if you have HBO, in most situations, you have access to HBO Max, so how could they only have 4 million? As it turns out, there is a number all the people who had the ability to automatically convert to HBO Max because of their existing HBO subscription through the various platforms that they had was about 23.5 million people. However, the number of people that actually activated it, which means they actually signed up for HBO Max, logged in with their credentials to actually access it, was only 1.16 million, which is only about 5%. So that's where that is. And then obviously the other amount of people, the other 3 million are people who purchased the service themselves or signed up for the service themselves as a new subscriber. So they only actually have about 4.1 million subscribers as of June 30th. That is active subscriptions, and that specifically just relates to the fact that while there are lots of people who have access to it, not a lot of people are actually using it, which of course is a downfall. But the one huge highlight is that the engagement rate of the people who are actually using the service is extremely high in comparison to people who signed up for Disney Plus. Now, if you remember correctly, Disney Plus had like 10 million subscribers in like the first week. Huge numbers, great for Disney Plus. And obviously we're 2 months in, or a month into HBO Max's launch, and they only had about half that, not even half that. And so, of course, people are automatically going to compare the two services and say, well, HBO Max is clearly not as successful as Disney Plus. But however, when you look at the people who are using it, the engagement levels are super high, which is really, really good considering Disney Plus, how on the other hand, for the first month, they had their big series, which was The Mandalorian, huge engagement numbers with that. But for some reason, the engagement levels per user are actually way higher for HBO Max. So there's that bright side right there. The other bright side is that there are shows on the service. Obviously, they didn't launch with as many series as they thought they were going to, as many as they wanted to because of everything happening with the pandemic. They didn't have the Friends reunion special that they originally planned on launching with. There's a lot of content that they didn't have. However, the one plus side is that they did release a list of a lot of the content that people are really watching and engaging on, which is similar in the vein of what Netflix does with their top shows that they're constantly talking about. But surprise, to no one's surprise, Friends is actually the top series on the service. And then Big Bang Theory is also in the top group, as well as the HBO Max original Love Life, which I can personally say I just watched this past weekend. It was actually very enjoyable. My wife enjoyed it a lot as well. And it's not just the older content that's getting traffic. It's also going to be, so it is some of that original content. They also said that the Looney Tunes original shorts, the new ones, they're getting a lot of traffic as well. So there are some bright spots, but they definitely do need to convert a lot of those other HBO subscribers that have the ability to have HBO Max. They really need to convert those into HBO Max active users. And part of that's going to happen in just a little bit of time, because by the end of this week, we're going to have HBO Now shutting down, HBO Max only existing, and HBO Go switching over to just HBO. So people who would not have otherwise used HBO Max will kind of be forced to use HBO Max, and hopefully those numbers boost up in the next quarter.
I have an unpopular opinion about this. I think that they should have, as much as I love the name HBO Max, and I totally understand it, I think they should have changed it. And here's why. It's not so much about the name itself. It's that the root of it is HBO. And then adding the Max is just an extension that you get other content with it as well. Instead of launching something that's new and getting people on board with it, they've done this lackluster way of rebranding HBO to be HBO Max, not really telling people until like the launch that they're apps would automatically transfer into HBO Max. As people that we study, streaming services, we didn't have that information until very late in that process of like, we knew HBO Max was coming out, but we thought it would be like you getting a new app or something. It's like, no. They're updating the app, and HBO is now being HBO Max. And it's you have situations like that are confusing, and just hearing the numbers and how they're qualifying who's new subscribers, wholesale, resale, it's stuff like that. It's like, even with my math degree, it's like, okay, I need a sheet of paper. I need like 5 sheets of paper. I need to write down stuff. I need to draw all the boxes to figure out what all the numbers are going. And I just think that Warner Media just has a little bit of a mess on their hands. HBO Max it's not a failure. It's not Quibi. They have decent content. The app experience is all right. I'm personally annoyed because it's not on Roku, but that's fine. They're in a club with others. It's their issues are more of a branding awareness problem, and it's not the people that you would think that would matter for the branding and awareness. It's investors, it's analysts in the market. It's just, even people who have way too much time on their hands and want to be armchair analysts are sitting there and it's like, well, HBO Max isn't really growing because it only got 4 million subscribers. And it's like, well, they kind of already bootstrapped because their HBO customers changed to HBO Max customers automatically. And then they got a plus 4 million on top of that. And then you count the numbers. And so I think that they have created this huge headache for investment and analysts, which, hey, they're not like beholden to us. I mean, they do what they want and we just go along for the ride. But it seems like there's so much mental math that has to happen to figure out how on track HBO Max is. I think that's going to hurt them in the initial bit. I think over long term, it's going to converge to a point where people are going to understand the difference between everything that's going on, all of Warner Media's different sub companies and brands and situations and apps and stuff like that. But right now, I think there is confusion for a lot of people. And unfortunately, the app itself is fine. What people are going to start to, I think what Warner Media has to be worried about is social media's reaction to this and how people get on the internet, and humanity has a bent toward negativity. We might talk about that a little bit later too, but humanity has a bent on negativity, and it's just something we tend to talk about that a lot. We tend to focus on negative things more, the positive things, just by how we're wired, and it just grabs our attention. I'm afraid for Warner Media that they're going to get in a situation where they have a decent product of HBO Max. It's got a decent content library. It's not like, it doesn't involve the bells and whistles, but there's definitely worse content libraries rolling out right now than theirs. They have the brand of HBO Max and the HBO team that's behind them creating content for the brand, and you're gonna have a solid B plus streaming service that's going toe to toe with all these top tiers trying to make a name for itself. And it's going to be dragged down by investor and analyst perception of the service based on online and people talking about how it's only got 4 million customers and 4 million subscribers, and it's look at Disney Plus, it's got 37 million or whatever their number is, and Amazon Prime's 150, Netflix is 193. Like, look at this tiny streaming service, just don't even give it a chance. Like, that negativity spreads and it's viral, and I'm that's what I'm concerned about with HBO Max and this whole entire launch is just its perception by outsiders. And I think that's going to help grow or hurt the service. And that's my concern. That's my issues with this whole entire launch. So it's weird because usually most of my critiques on launches are about, I'm trying to put myself as a user of the service that knows nothing really about technology except the basic premise and try to enjoy it that way. Or I'm coming at it kind of from a different aspect of just seeing a lot of the behind the scenes and being privy to that. It's just that negativity is spreading, and the different online forums that I'm in, Twitter, Facebook, Discord, just the places that I'm in, just people are giving HBO Max a bad rap. And it's like, really? But it's just because of, oh yeah, I heard this from this other person, or I saw this Reddit link to an article that has next to no decent sources that's citing something, it's giving their critique that's super biased about it. So I think that that's a huge drain on HBO Max and its launch, and it's holding them back. So if they can fix that, fix the perception about the service, I think it's going to allow HBO Max to even grow further and further and further. But this is just really a time problem. As more people get used to HBO Max as being a thing, people understanding that there's a difference between HBO and HBO Max and HBO Go and HBO Now, and all those different labels of HBO, people will eventually converge on the right idea. But it's like, until the time where there is convergence, like how much damage is there going to be on the service? And that's hard to quantify. That's hard to give a true estimate about. But that's my biggest risk and my biggest issue going with their launch. And it kind of encompasses both the Variety article that you mentioned in the Deadline article. HBO Max is just kind of like it's just weird. It's always been a player of like, we're going to do our own thing and we're going to go at our own pace. And they really are doing their own thing and go at their own pace. And it's just concerning. So,
well, the one thing I have to say in to kind of counter what some of what you're saying is there is a way to see that they are addressing the problem with the multiple apps of HBO, HBO Now, HBO Go, HBO Max. Because July 31st, HBO Now is going away, HBO Go is being rebranded to just HBO, and there will only be two apps. So there will be HBO and there will be HBO Max. And if you're a new subscriber, it makes perfect sense to subscribe just to HBO Max. But yes, it is one of those things where they probably should have addressed this before this service actually launched. But I can also see the reason why they didn't, and that would be because not every TV provider, not every service out there, including Amazon and Roku, had the ability to make sure that they did not have the ability to make sure that this was going to happen beforehand. So it's not like they could have immediately gotten rid of HBO Now, then be left with the situation where anybody who's already subscribing to HBO on Amazon and Roku is out in the void. They have no HBO content whatsoever, and they basically can't continue to subscribe because they don't have the ability to subscribe to HBO Max. Now it's all being rebranded. It all makes perfect sense, and I think that going forward, it's going to work.
And my criticisms are more of like, I'm imagining everything up until like today's recording, like everything that's happened until like since it's launched, even before its inception until now. I know in the future that they are going and are proactively addressing those concerns and those issues, but I was just thinking more of a historical look back of like doing that retrospective, like doing hindsight, just trying to see, okay, what would have been different, what would have worked a little bit differently, and they're working on it, yeah. But it's like, man, they could have just saved themselves a lot more pain just by doing just some changes before. But you're totally right. They are actively working on it, and we're seeing that. It's just it's going to take some time. I'm just worried about how much damage is going to happen that's going to be permanent during this time of them changing things, making it easier on consumers, people to understand what is going on, getting their product out there, getting it on Roku. Please let that happen. And Amazon Fire devices. It's just they have a lot of work for themselves. And I just wonder how much permanent damage they're doing in this medium of them getting to the point where they need easily accessible by everybody. And HBO Max is the thing. It's just until that point, how much is going to be permanent? That's kind of my concern. And it's a little bit open-ended, but it's my wonder.
All right. And then jumping over to Peacock. Peacock has launched an Olympics channel counting down to the 2021 games. Now, if you're wondering why they would have started this, well, that's because the 2021 games were originally the 2020 games, and that, of course, was the big thing that was going to help Peacock really launch out there with the nationwide launch and have a lot of content that was tied to the Olympics. So now, despite the fact that they don't have that content and they've still gone ahead with their launch, they are trying to figure out ways of people keep remembering this is still something that will happen eventually on Peacock.
I'm not gonna lie, I find this just pretty funny. There are a lot of people that I know that love the Olympics, and that's great. I just don't know a whole channel being dedicated on the Olympics is going to be that enjoyable. And it also kind of depends on the products that they have. I mean, if they have like a lot of good soccer content, like that can draw a lot of viewership because everyone loves classic soccer matches. If it's going to be more like interviews and stuff like that, I'm just concerned that they're just spending time and money on something. Depending on how things go in the United States, in the world, there's a chance that there might even be a 2021 games. I mean, heaven forbid that, but there is that slight possibility of that happening. So I just find it's just a very desperate move of, we need content. Hey, we promised the Olympics, and you'll get your Olympics, a channel of everything that's happened on NBC since we got the rights to it. So it seems like a desperate move in my opinion. But
all right, so then moving over to some niche streaming services, we've got some more stuff related to the slow suffocation of DC Universe, which is, as we already talked about, I believe on a past episode, we talked about how Harley Quinn is heading over to HBO Max. It has actually been confirmed. Harley Quinn's first 2 seasons will actually head over to HBO Max the middle of August. That has been confirmed. But the other part that is spelling the end of DC Universe, at least in the current form that it is that they recently announced that they are ending yearly subscriptions. Now, DC Universe launched in 2018, September of 2018, and part of the ability of signing up for the service was you could sign up for the entire year at the time. As you would probably figure out if you signed up during the year when they launched in September, not only did you get a full year, but one of their promotions was, I believe, you get 3 extra months for free. But then you would then have another year. But basically, starting immediately, you can no longer have a yearly subscription, which means there's a couple of possibilities here. And the most likely one, in my opinion, is that DC Universe is going to be shifting their price point to some other price point than, I believe it's right now, $7.99 per month. They're going to be shifting that price point to some other price in the future, not necessarily in the immediate future, but sometime in the future. And part of the reason behind that is that yearly subscription, which I believe was $80 at the time, that subscription price could be too much if the price decreases, or if in some weird way it increases. I don't see it increasing, but I would see it decreasing. But I honestly think that the ultimate situation that's going to occur with DC Universe is that their price point is actually going to go down because the amount of original content is going to be a lot less, or they'll have access to some of the content, but it'll be exclusive specifically over to HBO Max. There's also word that Titans is potentially going to be moving theirs over to HBO Max in the future as well. But there's no official word on that yet. There's just some rumors and stuff through the grapevines that I've heard about potentially Titans moving over to HBO Max as well. The only issue with that specifically is that internationally, Titans has their licensing rights with Netflix, so it spells a problem when it comes to the eventual global expansion of HBO Max, because there's already problems because there's some licensing content that wouldn't be able to happen. However, we already know that HBO Max is already walking over a minefield of licensing rights, so when they eventually roll out internationally, they're going to have to walk that minefield and juggle everything that they possibly can to get as much content as they can in each region when it's available. So I don't see that as a huge holdup necessarily, but I do see the future of DC Universe drastically different than what it was 2 years ago when it launched.
Yeah, it's changes coming, changes happening. I love DC content. I think DC Universe was a great idea in 2018 at the time. However, with the launch of HBO Max, it just doesn't make sense from business standpoints for them to be the sole distributor of DC content per se. I think that HBO Max being on there, you can have a larger audience and reach, obviously, but I think that it's just resource-wise, Warner Media, Warner Brothers would spend their money more economical ways. You have all the talent at one place. You don't have to build out talent in-house. You don't have to do streaming technology in-house. You can bolt on to the HBO Max team of infrastructure and all that stuff. So it makes a lot of sense from that end. And I understand as people who love comics that there's some people out there who are upset about this change, that the content's moving over from DC Universe. They liked it. It's moving over to HBO Max. But overall, it's the same parent company. It's just basically organizational restructuring and making things just having some brand cohesiveness and cohesiveness in their products and offerings. So it makes a lot of sense, and I understand the worry and concern, but AT&T has a lot of different streaming services under its banner, and it just doesn't make economic sense to have all of them running. And given it, and many people who like, comics, who like superhero movies and stuff like that, I bet it just didn't make sense for them just to keep it as is. So there's going to be changes, and I think that's fine. I think DC Universe has a place, and it has a place more as being a way to either sell comic related merch, but I doubt that. But really, I can see it having a great, little niche market is in owning and nailing and advancing, digital comics. DC Universe, as part of it, you get shows like Titans, Harley Quinn, stuff like that. You also get, comics that you can stream on your computers or tablets. They have to be like a year ago in publication date, but you can read as many comics as you want. And I think it's just the UI. It's just simple to read those comics, and having comics as a subscription service versus maybe paying it per title as in Comixology, which is Amazon's comics offering. I find that to be a little bit easier to handle, and especially just really liking DC stuff, it makes a lot of sense. So, for those people, I think, AT&T understands what works at DC Universe, and it's comics, and they're going to move that to be its own thing, and then move all live action or animated, any type of, media content is going to move over to HBO Max, and I think that's for the best.
All right, and then YouTube has announced that YouTube Kids will be releasing over 100 films and specials for free. These are going to be releasing in batches over the course of the next month through August 31st, but there's one reason for this, and Tony, what would that be?
Ads. Man, so my 3-year-old woke up at 3 a.m. and she could not go back to sleep. So my wife turned on Peppa Pig, which is on YouTube. You can find all the time streaming. But you walk through and there are a whole bunch of ads that your kid will watch. And this is just an ad play. There's something about when your kids ask you to buy a toy that for some they find it hard to say no. I find it very easy to say no, but that's just me. And I think, Dustin, you're kind of the same way. But for some, advertising through your kids is a very profitable thing to do. And it makes a lot of sense. And it's just getting more eyeballs, more viewership numbers, more data collected about either the TV or the device or your network connection. They collect a whole bunch of data. So this is a data ploy. Congrats, YouTube, for getting more kids hooked on your service and making them watch more ads. But yeah, this is simple ads.
All right, so moving on to other streaming providers. The only piece that we have here is that Plex has added 80 free live television channels. And then we're going to jump straight over to our main discussion, which is Netflix's Q2 results, which, like I said, we talked about very briefly on the last episode, but we wanted to dive a little bit more into the specific numbers. So the big key numbers here is that the earnings per share was actually 1.59 versus the 1.81 expected, so it wasn't as high as what analysts expected it to be. However, revenue was up significantly. It was 6.15 billion versus the 6.08 that was expected by the analysts. The global paid net subscriber additions was actually 10.09 million compared to the expected 8.26 million. And obviously, we already talked about the fact that Ted Sarandos became CEO, so we're not going to cover that here. Reed Hastings also said that he's planning on sticking around for at least another decade. Those were the main highlights of what was talked about, other than obviously them talking about some of the successful projects that were happening. However, the main focus for, I guess, a lot of tech sites in general was that Q3 forecasts, as far as what's coming from Netflix, are not great. And we talked about this briefly, but I want to get back to this. Forecasts aren't great because Netflix is trying to be realistic with their forecasts and not try to overstate how many potential subscribers they're going to have. They're also trying to make sure that their investors are wary of the fact that, hey, we have had some amazing growth over these past 2 quarters, but that isn't going to keep happening. There is a certain limit of how many people can keep paying for Netflix if they're still experiencing troubles with the economy and things like that. They're trying to be realistic with their numbers. However, most tech sites and most analysts are leaning into not so much how Q2 was very successful, but more on how Q3 won't be as successful, which I find super annoying. And I'm going to bring this back up in another conversation shortly here. But specifically talking about Q2 results, Netflix had a great quarter. I mean, there's no doubt about it. They had a great quarter. They grew their numbers significantly. I think a lot of people weren't expecting, obviously the analysts weren't expecting the numbers to be almost 2 million more than what they were anticipating. But the big thing is they brought in more revenue. It was a great quarter for Netflix. And I don't think there's anything to really take away from the quarter that is bad. And I don't think it's worth focusing on the fact that Q3 isn't going to be as great because the last two quarters have been really, really great.
I mean, honestly, I think it's unfair to even project what's going to happen in Q3. Just in the United States, and then that's where both of us are located. And just things are crazy in terms of COVID-related pandemic issues. So it's really hard to determine what's going to happen in the next 3-ish months. However you determine the quarter, some people have different ideas, but basically the next 3 months, it's hard to determine what's going to happen the next 3 months. Either things could get drastically worse, drastically better, stay the same. Like it's hard to predict that. So in terms of projections for streaming service, it's there's never been something like this. There's never been a pandemic where people are forced to stay home, not go outside, to not engage. It's just there's never been anything like this. So people have tried to compare things to the 2008 recession, to the 1918 Spanish flu, to the Great Depression overall. It's hard to compare, and I think since it is hard to compare and it's hard to have some ground of where we can make some type of forecast for the future. Overall, I just find their forecast kind of just pointless, and not anything against Netflix. It's so hard to predict the future given everything that's going on. There's not even a close baseline to compare it to something else with. So I think it's unfair a little bit for investors to be like, hey, we don't really like your Q3 numbers, but it's like, hey, look at the business overall, look at the growth, look at how they're pushing forward with international expansion and things like that. They're doing all right. They're doing fine. There doesn't seem to be a cause for concern of that things are going south. It's just, I feel like that's just a very narrow view on, I think, business strategy. I think by some of these analysts of just, we got to make sure that the stock price goes up, and that's fine. It's like there's more important things than just that. So I would say to somebody who's looking at these numbers and they're like, oh, it's down. I read this article that's down. It's like, let's just focus on, let's just do the best we can, and we'll update shareholders as we see fit. But we're kind of flying a little bit blind. That's basically what Netflix is saying, but not saying that. I'm happy with their numbers. They grew a lot, which is great. I was really more impressed, not just so much, I think people get a little bit, I think stock price is a sexy term, and there's a lot of focus on the stock market and the correlation that some people make with how successful the nation is or something like that. I think that's a little bit ridiculous. Stock price is a price on stock, but doesn't necessarily show how healthy the business is. And we know in the past that Netflix has accrued and acquired lots of debt, mainly because of their strategy to grow internationally and make their own content in-house. And it makes a lot of sense. But there have been some investors who've been worried about the cash flow and how that's working, and them having profitability and them taking on new debt all the time. And it was interesting to see the numbers that weren't just stock price and stuff like that. Their cash flow, it was actually positive for the second consecutive quarter, coming in at plus 899 million versus negative, losing 594 million in the second quarter of last year. So it seems that they found a way to lower their operating costs. Part of that, I think, is due to COVID, yes, but I think it's also that they've done better. They've figured out how to develop content just more efficiently, and they're getting a handle on that even better, so they can drive down costs. Part of that's due to their works in AI and engineering and technology. And I think also they found their niche in terms of what content works in different regions, and they're just rolling with that and working with that. So I think that's great. Unfortunately, why I think Netflix's approach during this time of COVID-19 and people maybe having less money to spend might actually work for them is because, unfortunately, as much as every financial advisor, when you're coming with money problems, okay, what subscription services do you have that aren't necessarily necessary? People have gym memberships, Netflix accounts from like years and years ago that they haven't just unsubscribed because it just there was never that nudge to do so. And so they're going to get a lot of income from people during this time when paychecks are short, just because of just the nature of subscriptions and how they work and how they function. So I don't think that they're going to lose that much money that way. But, they aren't impacted as much by ads as some other companies. And there's a big push for, boycotts for different things that's happening with Facebook. That's outside the realm of streaming. But there's a lot of interesting things that are happening in the advertising space, and Netflix is kind of insulated from that. So, they're getting that steady money, and they don't have to fight for eyeballs to make sure that people see your ad, click the impression, do all that type of stuff. It's just kind of a simpler business plan. So between like a lot of the stuff, I feel like Netflix is actually in a very healthy place to survive Q3 and to be productive. I think profitable, I can't guarantee that they're going to be profitable. I mean, who can? But I think that they're going to be productive. I think they're going to move forward as a company. I think that they're going to be as healthy as they can be. I'm concerned if how things work out at Q4, because we heard that a lot of their content, pipeline, like they had a lot of content queued up and they can make it to about Q4 pretty easily and fine. I'm worried about at Q4 and after Q4, depending on when Q4 ends for Netflix, because it's dependent on each company setting its own dates. But when it comes to Q4 and beyond, I'm curious what's going to happen with Netflix then, because what is the world going to look like? What studio is going to be open? They have to make some choices on maybe using a studio outside of the United States, but making content for the United States, like in different regions. So they have those choices to make, and I'm curious about that. But I think Q3 they're going to be fine, just because they have content in the pipeline already. They're growing, stuff like that. So I think when people talk and focus just on stock price and prescriptive, subscriber counts, it's like they're at 193 million. Like, besides growing internationally, they've kind of saturated the market. Like, until they get into new markets, they kind of saturated the markets that they're in. So it's as long as they don't lose subscribers, to me, that's a win. Given all the new players in the space of Disney Plus, of HBO Max, of Peacock, of CBS All Access is now changing their thing and becoming something crazy and huge with Viacom, CBS. Like, that's, as long as they're not losing subscribers, then that's kind of a win for Netflix, just of how huge they are and how much revenue they generate just by their already customer base that they already have. So that's my views on Netflix. I'm happy.
Yes. And so this brings up another topic that I wanted to discuss. This is something that I've been thinking about for quite some time. And you've actually brought it up on two separate occasions in this episode, which is the negative headlines from the media and how things can be portrayed specifically because of the negative headlines. So I'm going to just step up on top of a soapbox for a second and say this has very little to do with streaming, but I'm tying it into streaming because we obviously are the streaming wars. But one of the things that I have seen a lot over the last couple of months is a lot of articles talking about services that have launched and how they are negatively portrayed. So as Tony already mentioned earlier, you had HBO Max, and everybody was talking about how the confusion of all of the apps out there is potentially negatively impacting the growth of HBO Max because people are getting confused because they potentially see some of these articles. Something else that I see on a normal basis, I swear every single month, which I find super annoying, is the fact that there is articles talking about how licensed content is leaving not just HBO Max, but also Peacock, also some of the other services, and they make it seem like this content should have always been only on one service, when they're not thinking about the fact that it's content. Some of it is licensed. Some of it doesn't even belong to the studio itself. Some of it has to go somewhere else just because of what happens. Now, this happens with every service. This isn't exclusive to HBO Max. Obviously, the headlines recently have been HBO Max is losing all the Harry Potter films at the end of August. Go watch them now before they all go. Last month, we had headlines saying all these DC movies are leaving at the end of June. Watch them now before they disappear. There's no more DC content after the end of June because they're all leaving HBO Max. You've got the Jurassic Park films that were on Peacock. They're leaving at the end of the month. There was other films. There was an article even talking about how the Matrix films were leaving Peacock at the end of July. And I'm thinking, well, why would they stay? The Matrix films are part of Warner Media, not part of Peacock or part of NBC Universal. So the reality is that those films would eventually go back to whoever owns them. But it's not just that. Disney Plus loses films every single month, ones that they actually have the rights to. There was the whole Mighty Duck trilogy was on HBO Max when HBO Max launched because that just happened to be who had the rights to those films. Netflix, for the longest time, every single month, there's a group of stuff that leaves, there's a group of stuff that comes. It happens every single month. But for some reason, and I don't know why, but I feel like the last couple of months, there's been this onslaught of articles that are popping up all over the internet talking about how content's leaving HBO Max. It shouldn't be leaving HBO Max. All the content should just stay there forever. Same thing with Peacock. It launches and immediately people were talking about how all this content was leaving Peacock. And I just have to say, like, it gets frustrating as someone who is an analyst who's talking about this stuff on a regular basis, constantly seeing articles that focus so heavily on the fact that there is content leaving a service. Yes, There will always be content that's leaving the service. Netflix has been around for years, and every single month they put out a list of the content that's leaving and the content that is coming. It is not anything new, yet for some reason this is what everybody seems to focus on when it comes to these services in most cases. There's very little talk about the actual projects that are in production most of the time. There's very little outside of some casting announcements and things like that. There's very little regarding any of the projects that are actually being created, except for when stuff is leaving, and that is like a constant thing. And honestly, I understand that in general, articles need clicks, articles need to get that ad revenue, and every single month it's almost a guaranteed click for people to check out the article and find out what's leaving, what's coming. But it is just annoying as an analyst to have to see this stuff constantly happen, have to see people constantly talking crap. Now, and I'm not going to sit here and say that I don't talk bad. Obviously, I've talked bad about Quibi for months because I just find it annoying, but I find like that's different than just, hey, there's content that should be here that's not here. Why isn't this content here? It's not the same type of thing, and I feel like this just keeps coming up, and it's going to keep coming up because the Harry Potter films, once they leave HBO Max, they're not going to stay at, if they go to Peacock, they're not going to stay at Peacock forever and ever. The DC films will still be on a constant rotation. They're not going to be standing on HBO Max forever and ever. There's content on Disney Plus that will not stay there forever and ever. While they have secured the rights to obviously their big franchises like Star Wars, Marvel, I think all of the Marvel films have actually landed on Disney Plus at this point, so there's nothing that's out there in the wild on some other service. But it is one of those things where I just wish that journalism as a whole would stop taking such a negative approach to everything and just talk about the pluses of some of these services. It's fine to talk about the negatives when there's constructive criticism, but talking about content that is not available on a service after a specific date is not constructive in any way, because all it is doing is saying, look, this service that you're paying for, it's losing content. You probably should go find the service that this content is on now because it's not here. I personally don't subscribe to services specifically for one specific project. I know that there was people who dropped Netflix after Friends left Netflix. Personally, I don't subscribe to a service only for one type of content. I subscribe to a service for a variety of content, as I believe most people do. So I wish that journalism was a little bit better about not focusing on the negative, not painting the project, the services in such a negative light. Like Tony was saying earlier about HBO Max and all this confusion and a lot of the media talking about it. Netflix, the immediate reaction is everybody's talking about how Q3 results aren't going to be as great as they could be because Netflix is forecasting they're not going to be as great. So instead of focusing on an amazing quarter 2, let's focus on how quarter 3 is not going to be as great. It's frustrating when you're talking about the tech world, the business world, and the entertainment world, and it all gets mixed into one, and somehow everybody still focuses on all the negative stuff when there's all kinds of positive things happening in these worlds all the time that all correlate with each other. So I understand that I'm probably not the only person who has a problem with this, but I also understand that a lot of people will just accept the fact that this is the case, and I'm not going to sit there and not go to a website because of this, but it is just something I wish would change, because it just feels like, in general, the online community and as a whole is just becoming more and more negative, and I just wish we could spread a little bit more positivity.
Very interesting response to this. So I'm gonna disagree with you, and then I'm gonna also agree with you at the same time at a different point. So I disagree because I think the article in question that we're talking about Peacock and content leaving Peacock, like this specific article itself, I think it is warranted. I think the criticism is warranted because, Peacock launched and then immediately content's leaving. A lot of big content that is leaving that they promoted was going to be on their service as part of their marketing ads. So if you're a member of Comcast, you actually got access to this content way sooner than other people for the general launch. If you're Comcast subscriber who subscribed and you had special access, with the content leaving now, it does kind of fit in the normal ebb and flow of, okay, the content was here and then now it's gone. But the timing of the general launch for Peacock, that to me is a little bit concerning, because you had as part of the marketing ploys and also it's leaving. So I understand that criticism. I think it's a little bit unfair for the article to be like, okay, it's look at all the stuff that's leaving, how ridiculous is it? But I think that the timing of the content leaving and the launch was poor. If they would have moved up the launch a little bit and then waited a few more weeks before this content would have left, I think that would have been fine. Or maybe the content would have left before the general launch, and that would have worked too. So I think that this article has a valid criticism due to just the timing of it all. So if NBC would have just reorganized some things, then I think this wouldn't be such a big issue. But to focus more on the negativity bit, I mean, there was interesting research that Facebook did that found that they actually modified their algorithm, and they found that it actually had a perverse effect, that people were more engaged because it increased negativity that was going on. It's tapping into the negativity bias that just humanity has, where we focus more on the negative, and that drives clicks. Like, unfortunately, like, oh, look how bad this is, it's going to drive clicks. And as journalism, yes, I think that they should be more wary of that concern of what are they fostering, what community are they going to foster. I think that we try to do a decent job of, as much as we rail against certain topics, we try to also include the positive and try to tell that part of the story as well. But unfortunately, it makes humans are more prone to negativity in general. And I think it's also, there's a lot of crossbleed between what's happening in society right now. There's been a lot of negative issues and events and things that have happened. And I'm trying to be very broad and specific, but especially where I live personally in the United States, there's been a lot of negative things that have happened. And there's a lot of negativity in the world due to certain events. COVID-19 is a huge contributor to that. And I think that that's kind of bleeding over into, people's opinions of different things, people's opinions of streaming services. So I think I think we're getting some cross bleed from there. And then I think also it's just easy to kind of be like the culture wars, like Dustin, we're really into comics, and it can get pretty negative at times, because either your team DC Marvel, your team this writer, or this version of Batman versus this version, or something. Like, we see that all the time, and I think we're kind of seeing that start to spew out in streaming too. If either your camp Netflix, your camp HBO, your camp Disney, like, we're kind of getting tribalism that's happening in the space. And it's easy to, if you're part of this tribe, it's easy to look down on the other tribes that are happening. And it shouldn't be that, because, if the goal is to get good content at an affordable price wherever we want it, on our phones or TVs or something, streaming's the way to go. Like, a rising tide does lift all boats. The more streaming services that are out there that promote high quality streaming, that provide competitive price points, is better for user experience and engagement overall. So it's promoting negativity and coming down on other streaming services just because it's the easy thing to do, because it's we're part team Netflix. Like, we've always done it a certain way. Like, we don't like HBO business model or something like that. It's like, I feel like that's just childish and juvenile, and it misses the point of what streaming is supposed to be, is delivering good content to people who can afford it wherever they are, and sharing stories to others. And how important I think streaming is during this time. Like, a lot of us are forced to work from home, to live from home, to not go out, to not experience social engagements with others in a certain way. Like, how important has streaming been for us personally? And so I think that streaming is offering avenues and ways for people to let off some steam, to enjoy life, to be a part of humanity once again, to view interesting projects in new ways, to learn more about history in the past that we never learned before. And that's why I think it's ridiculous that there's all this negativity that's starting to fester in the streaming space. It used to be that there were just constructive critiques of different services and what they provided and offered. But now it just seems like there's this camp of tribalism that's brewing up, like, we're either this team or this team. And I really hope that stops, because the more is better. And we could just look of if there wasn't Netflix, or if there isn't any streaming services during this time of COVID-19, I wonder what the world would be. I think more people would be more depressed than they are right now. More people would be struggling. All more people would struggle to stay at home, and it's already hard enough to stay at home, but struggle to stay at home instead of going out. So it's just, I agree with you overall that negativity in the streaming space should stop. And it's easy. The easy articles to write are about the negativity and to focus on the negative, focus on Netflix isn't reaching the goal. Why don't we focus on what Netflix is doing right? They're increasing the cash flow, taking on less debt. They're getting into more countries, telling more stories to more people in their native language than ever before at high quality. Why isn't that not something to celebrate and to focus on? Yeah, it is easier to focus on the negative. So it's that's kind of like my two-pronged response to you is like, I agree in general that there's this negativity that's going on. It's easy to focus on that. But in the specific case of Peacock, I think that the criticism is legitimate. I do the show notes with you. We host the podcast. We read a lot of tech news. There's a lot of negativity that is out there that's spreading. And I wish it were to stop, because there's no place for it. We should all be about good content. We shouldn't fight each other over which streaming service is better than the other. I think that's ridiculous.
Agreed. All right, so the last article we're not going to discuss, but I just wanted to mention it. It's over at Seeking Alpha. and it's called Streaming Wars, A Tale of Creative Destruction. It's a great look at the streaming services and how the streaming wars have happened and how big tech companies have gotten involved, cable companies and entertainment giants have gotten involved. It's a very interesting article, definitely worth a read. There's some great graphics in there that I imagine will be popping up elsewhere because they are really informative. So definitely take a look at that. There's a number of trailers that have actually released for projects that are a little bit further out because Comic-Con, San Diego Comic-Con, which is generally held the end of July, should have happened this past weekend. There was actually a virtual convention where a lot of trailers released for a lot of genre-specific projects that are coming very soon. So that is why there's a bunch of projects that have question marks next to them as far as release dates go. With all of that being said, we're going to wrap up this episode. Be sure to follow us on Twitter and join our Discord to check out all the articles that we talk about here on the podcast and some that we don't. Also, be sure to follow us on Instagram for our latest announcements related to the podcast releasing. You can send us an email at thestreamingwars@gmail.com with any questions, comments, concerns, feedback, or anything else that you'd like us to talk about on future episodes. That is always greatly appreciated, as well as reviews wherever you are listening to this podcast. For Tony and myself, this has been The Streaming Wars, and we'll see you guys next time.
Thanks for listening to The Streaming Wars. Check us out on Twitter and Instagram. Also, consider supporting us on Patreon. Links can be found at thestreamingwars.io.